Hello to the Quimper Geological Society presentation. We are so excited to have you all here this evening. As I mentioned in the chat there, we were listened in to the musical stylings of Pickin' on a Led Zeppelin, a tribute. Shout out to Pat, our presenter, for making that recommendation. That was very fun to start off that way. I just want to give you a couple of tips for how to best enjoy this presentation this evening. I should mention, my name is Rebecca Koronowski, and I am the Engagement and Outreach Coordinator for Jefferson Land Trust. And I am here to make sure everything runs smoothly this evening. So you may have noticed that we have the majority of our participants on mute for the evening, and that is just to make sure that we don't have too many distracting sounds coming in during the presentation. So you'll be hearing from Michael and Pat here shortly. We do have a function for us all to be able to communicate with each other in the chat. And so if you are not familiar with Zoom, down on the bottom of your screen, potentially in the center of your screen, or you may need to push the 3 dots button that says more and find the option that says chat. If you're on an iPad or another device, you may need to tap your screen in order for those options to come up. And that chat box we will have open for everyone to chat with everyone, and that'll be the location where we'll send questions, or if there's anything that y'all need, you can send that into the chat there. And I see some folks chiming in, which is awesome. The other thing I want to mention, so down in that bottom bar on your Zoom menu there, you also have the option to turn your video on and off. And so potentially while the presentation is ongoing, you may want to turn off your video to give yourself a little bit more bandwidth. It's really nice to be able to have your heads nodding along and reacting with the visuals there for Pat as he's presenting. So give that a go. Oh, looks like we got a screen share going. Everybody's a presenter. Woohoo! We'll get that going in a sec with Pat's slides. So yeah, on the bottom of your screen, just slightly to the right of the bottom left-hand corner, you can turn your video on and off. Keep that on if you can, but if you'd prefer to be off the video, that is the way that you do it. And so I think that ends the tech orientation. So I'm going to pass it on over to Michael Machette. And we'll get you off of mute there, Michael.
Okay, am I being shared? No.
You are. We can see your desktop.
Oh, I can't. How are we going to do here? How do I undo that?
I turned that off for you.
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks for coming to the talk tonight, this afternoon, actually. My name is Michael Machette. I'm with the Quimper Geological Society. We're broadcasting from the international center of our organization here in Port Townsend. It'd be interesting to see if we have any people from out of state today. We'll do a little poll in a minute. Couple things to mention, that the time frame for today's talk is we'll have these introductory remarks until about 4:10. Pat begins speaking. He'll speak for about 45 minutes on the subject. And about 4:55 or 5 o'clock, we'll take questions and have answers from Pat. We'll use it, as Rebecca said, through the chat room. So if you've got a question about how this particular thing or that worked, just go ahead and post a question to chat. I'll monitor it during the talk, compile them, and we'll present Pat with half a dozen or dozen pointed questions at the end. A little bit about Pat. I've known him now for 3 or 4 years, although he's been in the area forever. He's an expert of the geology of Rainier National Park. He's a dendrochronologist, meaning he studies tree rings for various scientific studies. He recently retired from the Centralia College, the geology department at Centralia College in Centralia. He previously had been at the Department of Natural Resources and with the USGS at the Volcano Hazard Center in Vancouver. And so without further ado, I think we'll introduce Pat Pringle and let him roll with his talk.
Well, Michael, let's ask our audience some questions before we get there.
Can you post the poll?
Yeah, so we want to know a little bit about you all before we get started to help Pat frame some of his presentation. So if you're on a computer, you can click, or if you're on a device, you can tap and answer 2 questions and then click submit. And we'll see the results coming in here. And in just a few moments, after we give everyone a chance to participate, I will share the results with you all. We're at 87%, 88% reporting. 90, just a couple more seconds. Seems like there may be some new folks joining us this evening, which is wonderful. So I'm going to click end and share the info with you. So it looks like majority of folks are from Washington, but outside of Jefferson County, with Port Townsend coming in at a close second. And then as far as the geologic background, it looks like actually the majority of our audience does not have a geologic background, which is pretty interesting. I myself fit into the undergraduate study category, so I'm very happy to be able to help you all out with your event. So I'll stop sharing there. And just one more quick note, we are anticipating that we will go past 5 o'clock for the Q&A, but if you have to take off at exactly 5, you have something else to run to, that's totally okay. But just so you know, we may run a little bit longer because Pat has a lot of awesome information that he wants to share with you all, and we want to give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. And so now, without further ado, after that wonderful introduction from Michael, let's pass it on over to Pat. Hey, Pat. We can't quite hear you yet. There you go.
Yeah. For some reason, this poll is not disappear. Oh, I see.
You may have to click the X
I'm a little
on the
slow.
poll. That may be true for everyone as well. So in the top left corner for you, Pat, you may need to push the X on that poll to get it out of your way.
Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. Sorry. All right, I'm looking for the share screen. There it is. All right. Can you see the screen and can you hear me?
Yes, and yes.
All right. Well, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm really impressed with the turnout. This is sort of a snapshot tour of these various types of forests killed by past geologic events. And so the first slide here is, this is mostly the Northwest, some in Oregon, mostly in Washington. The first slide here is a historic picture. It's actually a painting by Canadian artist Paul Kane when he was on a Hudson's Bay Company trip down the Columbia and out west. And he was one of the first people to very accurately paint and the local peoples and the environment and the geologic features. And this is a picture in the Columbia Gorge, right near the town of Stevenson, Washington, looking to the southwest. And what he's painted is a picture of the Bonneville landslide, or which he called the landslip. And that's this long green feature you see trailing off into the Columbia from the right side of the picture. And one of the important things is in the foreground are all these submerged stumps in the river. Well, these stumps were later identified by Lewis and Clark, who speculated that one of their speculations was that this landslide must have come down and dammed up the river, and that's what drowned the trees all along the river. And it turned out they were right. And so this is a painting that was done just a few decades after they passed by here. I see now I have to be in PowerPoint to actually advance my slides. Okay. Not happening. There we go. So this next picture shows some subfossil trees. We call them subfossil. They're not because they're not petrified. And these trees are in a lake, Spider Lake on the Olympic Peninsula, over west of Shelton, about 23 miles, or northwest of Hoodsport, I should say, about 23 miles. And these trees are dammed by a big landslide that's hidden under the trees here. And they died about 1,100 years ago. And it turns out they may have been killed by a great earthquake that triggered the landslide. And that earthquake may have been on the Seattle Fault and some other nearby faults. And I'll be talking about those as we go through here. Here's another picture of a subfossil tree. This tree also dates to about 1,000 years old, 1,100 years old. And that's Trevor Contreras of the State Geologic Survey, who found these interesting trees. And they're near Hamma Hamma, Washington, on the west side of Hood Canal. And in fact, it turned out these trees correlate with the other trees that have been associated with as being victims of the Seattle Fault about 900 AD. So I'll talk about those too. This is at a location we call Hamma Hamma. And I'll go back just for a second. The reason some of these trees are preserved is they're preserved in fresh water. They don't rot. So all these trees in the lake, they rotted down to the mean high water table. And they're like little time capsules in there preserved. So, and this tree was buried in lake deposits, which you can see here next to Trevor. And so that's what the lake formed behind a little landslide that was probably caused by the Seattle Fault rupturing. And then the sediment and the lake preserved the trees. So here's a slide. I'm not sure how well you can see all the little dots. This is about 20 years old, but the little dots show a lot of locations all around the state where you have buried or submerged trees. The yellow ones are submerged. The red and dark red ones are in landslides or landslide dammed lakes. And the blue ones are killed by volcanic eruptions. And so I'll take you on a little tour of some of these locations right now. But first I want to talk about radiocarbon dating, which is a way to find out the age of past events if you can find some organic material to date. And it has to do with the fact that carbon-14, which is an isotope, a molecule of carbon, is an unstable isotope, meaning it undergoes radioactive decay. And about every 5,730 years, half of that will decay. So it's kind of like a time clock you can use. And that's called the half-life. So after 5,730 years, half of it will be gone. And if you can measure the ratio of the carbon-14 to carbon-12 in some piece of organic material, you can get the approximate age. And radiocarbon dating goes back about 55,000 years. It's useful. And a couple of the things that have made it very precise in more recent years is the calibration of the radiocarbon timescale, and I'll talk about that, using tree rings and also VARVs, little lake deposits that have carbon in them, and also technology. There's an instrument called a mass spectrometer that allows scientists to date very tiny pieces of wood. So if you were to send in a radiocarbon date, you would get, for some reason, my cursor isn't as large. Can you see this large cursor on the slides? Just want to know that.
No, unfortunately, we cannot.
Okay.
It's not as large as it was before.
Okay, it's big on my computer screen, but it's not. How about the laser pointer? Can you see that?
Yes. So folks are chatting in and saying they can see it. So that's great.
All right.
Thanks for checking.
Okay, so the laser pointer is showing you where the date is. And what this curve shows you right here is this is the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere that's been determined by tree ring studies. And it's very precise. And this is used as a calibration curve. So you can take your radiocarbon date over here, and then that date and the error associated with it can give you the precise calendar age. Well, the problem is that there's some wiggles and flat spots in this curve. So when you bring your raw age over, sometimes you get one of these broad area, like this date right here. I don't know if you can see it. This is all the possible ages associated with this date. So you can see it extends over 200 or 300 years. And the most probable date is right in the middle, but still it's flat. But if you take 3 different samples from different parts of a tree that are separated by a known number of tree rings, then you can best fit this whole array of samples onto this curve. And that gives you then each of these is a certain distance from the outermost ring. So that's called the offset. So you move those over to what would be the outside of the tree, and then you can summarize that and get a very precise age. So the reason the carbon-14 changes through time is it's an interaction. Carbon-14 is created by cosmic rays hitting nitrogen, the most abundant gas in our atmosphere, and that's modulated by the solar wind and the Earth's geomagnetic field and the flux of the cosmic rays that are coming in. So that's why this calibration curve has become so important for scientists to try to date things. And more recently, they've found these anomalies in the carbon-14 curve, like this one at 774, 775 CE, and also at 993. And these are apparently caused by cosmic ray bursts that are coming into the atmosphere. And so scientists can use these anomalies also. They can look for those anomalies in the wood to give you a more precise age. So another tool that we're using is tree rings. And one of the things we do is measure the size of the tree rings, and often that's associated with soil moisture. And you can use the barcode of the tree rings to match living trees with ancient trees, like this very timber here, this timber that's marked HH89. This is very historic because it is the timber that first allowed dendrochronologist Andrew Douglas to take his modern record of pine trees in the American Southwest, which he had developed about a 700-year chronology of pine trees, and he matched these timbers that were in the adobes of the ancestral Puebloan people down in the American Southwest. So he had 500 years of timbers all connected to each other, and when he found this particular log, HH39, it connected his living trees with those timbers. And for the first time ever in history, someone dated an ancient archaeological site to the actual year. In fact, he dated more than 500 years of ruins just by dating that one log. So that's quite a historic thing. So tree rings are very powerful. Radiocarbon is very powerful for understanding our history, especially human history. Of course, there's a lot of work involved. You have to take samples of the trees, and you have to sand them down, and then you measure the trees. This is Rosalie Lamb back in the 1990s. She was a high school student then who volunteered to help me out. And she eventually went on to get her master's degree in geophysics at MIT, and now she's teaching high school in Maine. Some other interesting types of tree rings you can use to date are these low density rings. Now, if you look at the very top here, you can see I've marked the year 1601. This is a tree from Mount Rainier. And you'll notice that the late wood, the dark part of the ring that forms in the summer, is very faint. And that's because in that the previous year, there was a very large volcanic eruption down in Peru that produced a lot of sulfur gases that created sulfuric acid, in the atmosphere. And those droplets of sulfuric acid in the atmosphere reflected solar radiation and cooled the planet down so much that it's recorded in the tree rings all over the northern hemisphere. So you had very, very cold summer that next year. And so those rings are marker rings, and we can find those marker rings all over the Cascade Range, for example. Okay, I'm ready for a poll. And I don't know whether I'm supposed to do the poll or Rebecca's going to do it.
Here we go. We have a question for you all.
Okay.
So have you ever counted tree rings on a stump? Yes or no? This is going to be the easiest one of the night, so you definitely want to chime in on this one. And the results are coming in, and I'll share them with you in just a moment. We're up to 80% of folks who've answered. Do you have a guess, Pat, of what's going to be the winner on this one?
I would say 95%, but
95% yes?
Yes.
All right, let's see how you did. Pretty close.
Oh, 90%. That's pretty good. Or 87%.
Yes.
Well, get busy, people.
So you may have to push the X in the top of the poll box if it's in your way. So either on the top left or the top right, push that red X and get that out of your way so you can see the rest of Pat's slides.
Okay, so here's a picture of what these little dots, you can probably barely see them, are locations of master chronologies. And this is where people have studied tree rings and put together some data that records the size of the tree rings. And most of these sites are available on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric website that stores climate data for the whole planet. And so notice on the left in the table that the tree rings for the Northwest, most of these data sets only go back into the 1300s or maybe 1200s. A few of them go back farther. One in particular is this Heel Lake chronology on Vancouver Island, goes back to 200 BC. And that's because Keibin Zhang, the grad student who did that project, looked at ancient trees, subfossil trees that had been carried into lakes by ancient debris flows. And also, there's another one here. I can't find it. It's Dave Yamaguchi's. Here's Long Island, Willapa Bay. And these are the living trees, some over 1,000 years old, that Dave Yamaguchi used to study, to try and date the Cascadia earthquake. So these trees are data sets that are used to try to determine the age of some of these subfossil trees that were victims of past geologic events. And the subfossil trees I'll be talking about here, some of them are the blue arrows down here in the center, lower left, lower right center, show the area of the Bonneville landslide. Then we have the Electron Mud Flow from Mount Rainier, and then the red and purple arrows up here are two other mud flows, or lahars, volcanic mud flows, that I'll talk about. So the first person I know of to really study tree rings in Washington and Oregon, a real pioneer, was Don Lawrence, who grew up in the Portland area. And he tried to date the past eruptions of Mount St. Helens. This is back, he started doing this kind of work back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so, and he came pretty close to dating the eruption. He thought it happened in 1802. He looked at trees that had been, he thought, defoliated by ancient pumice fallout. And so he came up with 1802 as the most recent large eruption of Mount St. Helens. Well, it turned out he was only 2 years off, because Dave Yamaguchi, who worked on this dating later, found out that the trees were so traumatized they actually skipped a ring. So Dave Yamaguchi came along in the early 1980s and was studying Mount St. Helens. I think he was originally going to be looking at a fire history of the area, and the eruption changed his project, because then he began to study not only the fire history, but also the history that was recorded in these past buried trees all around Mount St. Helens. And one of the great things he did was to date the last several very large eruptions of Mount St. Helens in about, it turned out to be late 1479 AD, around 1481 or 82 AD, and in 1800. And he dated many smaller events also, but it was the dating, the precise dating of these ancient eruptions that allowed geologists to go back and really characterize in a good way the eruptive periods that happen at Mount St. Helens, because that gives you a much better idea of what could happen during this present eruptive period. Now, Dave went on to work on another project with Brian Atwater and others, and that was trying to find out the dates of the most recent large earthquake off our coastline. And so he did that by studying these ghost forest cedars that are in various estuaries along the Washington and Oregon coast. And he and Brian and others worked on this for quite a long time, and eventually dated the earthquake to January 1700 AD. And there's a whole story there too about how the Japanese scientists also found the tsunami deposits from that earthquake. And of course turns out they had historic records that allowed actually a determination of the timing of the earthquake to about 9 o'clock in the evening of January 26, 1700 AD. because it's thought that it took about 12 hours or so for the tsunami to cross the Pacific to get to Japan. So this is an exposure, excuse me, along the Johns River, south of Grays Harbor, that shows several of these layers of submerged trees. Here's the 1700 layer, then an 1100-year-old layer, and then a 1600-year-old layer that record some of these past earthquakes. And so not only has David and Brian and others dated the most recent earthquake to 1700 AD, but people have used radiocarbon dating to build a record back in time. And we know for sure there were at least 13 large events off the Washington coast, and probably more, recorded in those deposits. And the reason they're recorded is because the earth subsides along the coastline every time there's one of these large Cascadia earthquakes, and that subsidence takes these trees down into the intertidal zone where they're both drowned and preserved. Okay, how about another poll? I thought, let's get two of these polls out of the way early in the presentation.
All right, so this one is more of a quiz. So we're asking for your best guess. What species is the oldest known living tree on Earth? So go ahead and just give it a guess. Oh, it seems like a lot of people know the right answer on this one, Pat. You know your audience well.
Either that or they know me well.
Stars align.
I can't figure out how to take the poll, or am I not able to do it?
Unfortunately, you're not allowed because
Okay.
it knows that you have the right answer.
Oh, that's true. That would be cheating.
Someone in the chat just responded, it's actually the oldest living organism on Earth. So there's a little cue.
Well, I think that might be confusing because the oldest living organism on Earth is a clonal organism.
Okay. They clarified, non-clonal. Okay, so
great.
here are the answers that we have received. Great guessing, everyone.
All right.
Is there any significance, Pat, to the Douglas fir or white oak, or are those just other trees that you picked?
They're two of my favorite trees. Can I admit that?
Yeah.
Yes, Douglas fir being such a great, being a tree that dendrochronologists have used with great success, especially in North America. It grows all over the world, but in North America, it's probably the tree most used for paleoclimate studies. And they can live to be more than 1,000 years old. Of course, that's one of the major trees we have in the Pacific Northwest. And white oaks are also awesome trees. Okay, moving along, we're going to jump down now to the Columbia Gorge and a little more Lewis and Clark. And these two diagrams are maps from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this one at the top shows the area of what's now Troutdale and Camas, Washington, and Troutdale, Oregon. And this is the Sandy River here, which Lewis and Clark, when they came there, commented, here was a river which had very bad quicksand. And they spent a lot of time describing this river and puzzling over it. And so they named it the Quicksand River. And today we know it as the Sandy River. But on their way back from overwintering at Fort Clatsop, they stopped here again. And they sent somebody 6 miles up the river, a Sergeant Pryor, to figure out what was going on. Well, as soon as my colleague at the USGS, Ken Cameron, saw this, he said, because we were working on the Mount Hood project then, he said, I think we're here right after an eruption, because the quicksand is the kind of thing you describe at the mouth of the Toutle River in Washington, just downstream of Mount St. Helens. So sure enough, that's what led us into our attempts to date the most recent eruption of Mount Hood. And so this diagram shows the area of the Sandy River over on the left, and I'll be talking about the Bonneville landslide here in a few more minutes. And the little red dots show the locations of some of these buried trees we studied. Here's some of the buried trees along the Sandy River near Oxbow Lake Park in Oregon. And this is a close-up of one of the trees, and you can still see the deposit of the lahar on the bark of the tree here. And this is right down by the water level. And up at Mount Hood, you can see in the landscape, the vegetation, even after 200 years, is still is in the successional stage on this old made flat. This is the pathway of that lahar from Mount Hood erupted from Crater Rock. This is the crater of Mount Hood up here, right upslope from Timberline Lodge. And hot pyroclastic flows, pyroclastic avalanches of hot rocks came down and gases, triggered a mud flow, a volcanic mud flow, a lahar that buried trees all the way down the river. And so we started collecting samples of those trees. We found buried trees, and we were able to find light rings like this 1601 in there, and also narrow rings like 1754 here, which had been described by Dave Yamaguchi at Mount St. Helens. And here's one tree with the bark on it, and its outermost ring is 1781. So we found several trees that had bark on them, 1781. And so we think that was the last eruption of most recent major eruption of Mount Hood. Okay, we'll jump up to Mount Rainier now, which has had a history of more than 40 eruptions since the last ice age. And Mount Rainier has had a huge influence on the landscape of the Puget Lowland. This picture on the left is a geographic reconstruction of what the area looked like 5,700 years ago before the great Osceola mud flow, this huge volcanic mud flow from Mount Rainier came down. And on the right, you can see that some of the estuaries that were there at that time, about 5,700 years ago, have been filled in by all the sediment that's been coming down from Mount Rainier over the last 5,700 years. And that includes many, many eruptions that carried a lot of sediment down, and had most of these eruptions also had periods of volcanic mud flows or lahars in which trees were buried that we later would find. So I'll talk about a few of these locations where there are buried trees. And here's a location in Kent, Washington. This is about 105 kilometers downstream of Mount Rainier. This is looking at Mount Rainier off in the distance. And these trees were uncovered in 1996, and we sampled about 20 of them. And we ended up, Jim Valance of the US Geological Survey helped me get a radiocarbon date. And the highest probability age range for this radiocarbon date is between 518 and 550 CE, so about 1,500 years ago. And we were able to match a chronology of 5 of the trees to this Heel Lake chronology from Vancouver Island. We think a good fit would be if the eruption happened in the spring of 525 AD. Well, I should go back because undergraduate student from Centralia College, Quinn Moran here, helped me measure these rings, and she presented this poster at the Geologic Society of America meeting in 2017. So here's just about 15 kilometers south of there, about 8-9 miles south of that forest, is another forest that was discovered about then in Auburn, Washington. Here's a tree stump that died about 1,100 years ago. And it turned out this lahar from Mount Rainier, it went all the way to the port of Seattle. That's about 130 kilometers from Mount Rainier. And it also went to the port of Tacoma. And I worked with another student who's a member of the Chehalis tribe, Michelle Kearns, and she and I found some Native American stories about this area that talk about the whales plowing through the land and forcing their way and changing the course of the river and allowing the river to come out. And we think that it's an allegory that fits this lahar more than a millennium ago. And so I just think it's significant that this story is still in their oral history after all that time, because obviously it was a huge event to them. It came down, it went to the port of Seattle, also came down here to the port of Tacoma and buried these trees. And I should add that that event also happened possibly right before the Seattle Fault earthquake, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. The Electron Mud Flow is a more recent event from Mount Rainier. It happened about 500 years ago. And So that is something I've been studying. It's been dated at about 500 years ago, 500 years old, as I mentioned. So I've been studying two buried forests, or I should say one buried forest and one drowned forest in Lake Kapausen here. So I'll talk a little bit about those. Also, there's an oral history about that event. And that is this story is not a myth. The head of Tacoma, which is one of the tribal names of Mount Rainier, burst open and the water rushed down the hillsides and swept the trees from the valley. The prairie about the town of Ording was called by us, whatever that is, which means open because the flood cleaned it and left it covered with porous stones. So in the early 1990s, excavations in this town of Ording uncovered a buried forest that was absolutely amazing. I mean, they were pulling so many trees out of there. This particular tree, State Senator Debbie Regala came out in the field with me, and she helped me tape the circumference of this tree after they'd pulled it out of the ground at 30 feet breast height circumference. So this tree, it turns out, was one of 50 that I sampled. And I'll tell you about the age in a minute. We got an age of about 1500 AD plus or minus 10 for that tree. And then I decided to go look at the submerged trees in Lake Kapausen that geologist Rocky Crandall had described as also being formed by the by the Electron Mud Flow, although he had never dated these trees with radiocarbon. So I had two students who were eager to work on this. One told me she had a dry suit, so she ended up diving and coring two trees. And the other, Jordan and I paddled around in my kayak and we took some samples for radiocarbon dating from the top of the tree. So the net result of that was we got a good radiocarbon date, also about 1500 AD. And we also got samples for measuring of tree rings. Now, early on, I noticed light rings in two of the trees brought down by this lahar from Mount Rainier called the Electron Mud Flow. And this is the top two pictures are from the same tree, but one shows the 1438 AD light ring and the other shows the 1448 light ring. Whereas these two lower pictures show the same ring from a tree up at Cougar Rock Campground at a higher elevation at Mount Rainier. So these rings in the Ording trees down at sea level aren't as well developed, but I think they were carried down from a slightly higher elevation where these kind of rings form. So this gave me the hint that this electron mud flow happened probably in the first decade of the 1500s or the 15-aughts. Now, I don't know whether we have another poll or not, but I put a space in for one.
You do have another one. And so again, this is a test of your knowledge. Definitely make your best guess. And if for some reason the poll is not showing up on your screen, I'll read it out loud and you can share with us in the chat what your guess is. So how far back in time does the record of tree rings go? 4,800 years, around 8,000 years, or 55,000 years? And it's a bit of a mixed guess on this one. So this is your stumper there, Pat.
Is that a pun?
Yes.
Well done, Rebecca.
I have trees on the brain.
After a while, puns just come to your brain, you know.
They do. So we're getting close to getting into full participation. And again, I apologize if for some reason the poll isn't showing up for you. And we can take your guesses in the chat and just follow along for the ride there, folks. Okay, I'm going to click end and share the results. I'll be interested to see your interpretation there, Pat.
Yeah, it turns out that two of the oldest chronologies in the bristlecone pines of the White Mountains of California go back to about 6,000 years BCE, so 8,000 years ago. There may be some older ones, and I'm thinking of the bald cypress trees, but I'm not sure. The bristlecones are the only ones I know about.
Okay, I'll stop sharing. And again, you may have to click the X on the top of your poll to get it out of your way.
Okay, so we'll jump now from Mount Rainier. There's many more buried forests at Mount Rainier, but we don't have time to look at them all. And but there is a connection here I'm going to talk about between the Bonneville landslide and the Electron Mud Flow, which is 130 kilometers north. And it's not a relationship between the two other than the tree rings story I'm going to tell you. So the Bonneville landslide is in the Columbia Gorge. This picture in the top right here shows this was taken by geologist Derek Cornforth, and it shows an oblique view looking due north. You can barely see Mount St. Helens off here in the distance and Mount Rainier up there. And it shows that this landslide came off Table Mountain here in the Columbia Gorge. And it actually at one time went all the way across the Columbia, and it dammed the Columbia River. This was that landslide that I was talking about in the very first slide, which featured the historic painting by Paul King. So the person that studied that again was Don Lawrence. This picture in the top left shows Don and his wife in 1950. And both Dave Yamaguchi and I were honored to meet Don in the 1980s. He actually reviewed the first paper for me that Ken Cameron and I ever published on Mount Hood. And he worked with David on his studies too. And what a pioneer. I mean, he was out here taking samples of the submerged forest trees, did the first publication on the Bridge of the Gods. And these are the trees he studied, this drowned forest of the Columbia. This particular picture here is at the town of Wyeth, which is shown right about here on this map that was in Don Lawrence's book, or first paper on the Bonneville landslide. And he was the first person to try to get radiocarbon dates on these trees also. He and his wife counted more than 3,000 snags of trees in the Columbia Gorge. And again, most of these now, almost all of them are drowned behind the pool of water that's dammed up by Bonneville Dam. So Don in 1987, I was out in the field with him. He was about 90 years old then, and he told me all the tree samples were gone. So we were totally bummed about that because we thought maybe we could sample them. But this one turned up. Nathan Reynolds, who was working on it with us, called the World Forestry Center and actually they found two of his original slabs of these drowned forest of the Columbia trees in a crate in the basement of the World Forestry Center. And it turns out that the World Forestry Center burned down in 1964, and Don thought his trees went up in flames, but by happenstance, they'd been lent out to Thornton Munger, a biologist, a forest scientist down at Oregon State University. And later on, after Thornton Munger was done studying them, he sent him back to the New World Forestry Center. So it's a bit of geologic serendipity that they actually turned up and that Nathan was able to call and track them down. So that allowed us to sample the trees and get new radiocarbon dates on them. And then in 1978, before that, another tree was found when they were digging the excavation for the second powerhouse at Bonneville. And so that tree also proved useful. And so we were able to get radiocarbon dates, very precise dates on the two slabs of Don Lawrence's trees and the tree that was recovered in 1978. And that gave us a date between about 1425 and 1450 CE. And since then, and also you can see that I was able to match the tree rings from each of those three locations together. And it shows up pretty well in this these wiggle curves here. This is the high frequency data from these three locations of these trees. Now, Jim O'Connor of the USGS has reconstructed the height of the lake that drowned the trees behind Bonneville Dam, and that lake would have been probably at least 275 to 280 feet elevation, would have extended all the way over to eastern Oregon and Washington. So I was able to match the Electron Mud Flow trees, if you remember those from a few slides ago, and match those tree ring patterns and barcode with the Bonneville landslide trees, and I found out there's 61 years difference. And that fits the radiocarbon ages, which are shown by these boxes here, the most probable radiocarbon ages for each of these events. And it shows the Bonneville landslide probably happened in the mid 1440s and the Electron Mud Flow in the first decade of the 1500s. Now I know the exact year, but I can't say it yet because you want to make a big splash when you publish the data, right? So next I'll talk about the Seattle Fault, which is a large fault that goes across east to west across Puget Sound, and just some of the work that's been going on there recently. And I've been collaborating with Trevor Contreras of the State Geologic Survey and Emily Carson, a high school science teacher who's currently at Olympia High School. We had a Partners in Science grant to work on this project. And I'm also collaborating with Brian Sherrod at the US Geological Survey and Brian Black at the Tree Ring Lab and Jesse Pearl and other people who have been studying these faults, and Jesse and Brian are tree ring scientists who are also studying this event. So I'll point out the Hamma Hamma trees, which are over by this little blue box here, trees in Lake Washington, trees at the West Point sewage treatment plant, which happened to be in a tsunami deposit, and Lower Dry Bed Lake and Spider Lake are the two locations I've also talked about where you have trees killed by earthquakes. So in the early 1990s, Gordon Jacoby and Brendan Buckley and Patrick Williams were able to match the tree rings from the tsunami deposit, which is right here with the trees in Lake Washington. And so he didn't give a precise age for the event, not to the year, but at least match the tree rings in either location. And this is a cut up slab of the tree that Brian Atwater found in the tsunami deposit, and that yielded a high precision age of 900 to 930 AD. Well, here's the trees over along the Hamma Hamma area again, and this is Emily and one of her students who were sampling these trees. And so we were able to correlate this tree with the tree in Hamma Hamma with the tree in the tsunami deposit, both killed by the Seattle Fault. And we're able to match, and this is not just my work. These are my wiggly, not so great wiggle charts, but I and other dendrochronologists have been able to match the Hamma Hamma rings with the tsunami tree, deposit tree at West Point, and also with Lake Washington trees, although you can't see it too easily with that curve right there. And with the Hamma Hamma, or excuse me, with the Heel Lake chronology on Vancouver Island. And I think one thing that really stands out, the red curve here is the trees we looked at by the Hamma Hamma River. And especially what shows up is this mega drought here between the late 1770s and the 1810 or so. And you can see it both in the Heel Lake tree ring record and in the tree ring record over by Hood Canal there. In fact, you can see a couple other sort of dry times as well. So, and then Jesse Pearl and Charlotte Pearson at the Tree Ring Lab and Brian Black also helped out on this. But Jesse worked up the data to look for these radiocarbon spikes that were due to the cosmic ray bursts in 774 AD, 775 AD. And indeed, they were able to find them in the Lake Washington trees and in the Hamma Hamma trees. And so that was able to confirm this cross dating of an event that shows the Seattle Fault ruptured about 920 CE. And again, I'm giving you the approximate age. That's pretty close, but not the precise age. So it turns out there are other faults that link up to the Seattle Fault, possibly. And there's the Tacoma Fault, about 15 kilometers south of the Seattle Fault. There are also submerged trees that record the rupture of that fault. And as of yet, those are remaining to be studied. But this is what the this is one of the efforts. Now, what happened to me? Did I just get out of Zoom?
You're still here.
Okay, can you see me? For some reason, I'm not seeing the Zoom. I can't even see my screen.
There may be some floating controls hiding at the top or bottom of your screen.
Okay, I see the controls, but I don't see the Zoom. I don't see my slideshow on the screen anymore. Okay, well, I'll just keep talking. In this slide, you can just see on the, I'll just describe on the left side of the screen, the Saddle Mountain faults and Price Lake scarps. If you can just see those by the green forest symbols over there. And those are areas where we have similar radiocarbon dates, and Brian Sherrod, Brian Black, the dendrochronologist, and Jesse Pearl will be looking at those, and with submerged trees killed by the Tacoma Fault right in the center of the diagram, to see if they're similar to the Seattle Fault and correlate with the Seattle Fault. And also up by Waterman Point there, if you can see that in the top center of the screen, Jesse and Brian have found some trees that died in the mid 1500s. And so they're looking at that as well. And for some reason, I can't even advance my slides anymore. I can't figure that out.
Could you go to your bottom tray?
Oh, here I am.
from
I'm back
PowerPoint?
again. I got it.
There you go.
Okay. Okay. And so how are we doing on time here? Do I have a few more minutes? I'm
We're
getting close
about
to the end.
7 till 5.
All right. So
Oh,
we're
you're
getting
doing
close
great.
here. We're getting close. So I want to talk a little about Lake Crescent since it's close to Port Townsend. And here's you can see there are some faults that go through Lake Crescent, and Lonnie Leothold and Carl Wegman at North Carolina State University have been studying this along with other colleagues, and Liz Shermer at Western Washington University and other colleagues, including Brian Sherrod, have been studying these as well. And they've made some big discoveries about Lake Crescent and the ages of some of the fault structures and past earthquakes on these fault structures. And I don't know all the details, but I know that Carl Wegman and his associates have found on the bottom of Lake Crescent a very large turbidite or submarine landslide that happened about 3,000 years ago. And so I'm just going to mention that there are some submerged trees in Lake Crescent, and I have some information on the dates of those trees. Now, it's worthy of noting that the Lake Crescent was created by a giant landslide, which dammed up and separated Sutherland Lake here, or Lake Sutherland, from Lake Crescent. And there's a species of trout that is thought to have been ecologically separated from its ancestors and has conducted a separate evolutionary path here in Lake Crescent called the Beardsley trout. So there's a number of different submerged trees in the lake. You can see one of them in this picture on the left here. And National Park Service divers collected cores from 3 of these trees in the early 1990s and gave me the cores. And eventually I got radiocarbon dates on these trees. And also Bob Schuster and Josh Logan from the State Survey, and Bob was with USGS. They also sampled some of these trees. And so one of the trees was just floating in the lake, but it was probably carried down by a landslide here at Saratoga Point. They got a date of about 280 plus or minus 60, which is suspiciously close to the timing of the Cascadia earthquake. But I was able to cross date that tree to 1704, the outermost ring. So it seems to have come down a few years after the Seattle Fault earthquake. The log cabin tree was found up here. It's a horizontal tree deep in the lake. It was dated at 3,000 years old. The Fairholme tree, which is off the picture in the west side of the lake, dates to about 4,000 years. And then the Bovey Meadows tree here is also about 300 years old. So here's a picture of the debris dam between the 2 lakes. And they think the lake was formed by two giant landslides, one from the north and then one from the south. Excuse me, one from the south and then one from the north. So this is just a quick video, if I can make it work here, of there you go. So I'm going to this is a video that shows Dan Pomprion to the Park Service coring trees underwater. I can't find the slider. I'm trying to make it advance, but I'm just going to run it for a second or two to give you an idea that he's 80 feet below the water level coring these trees.
Where's this located, Pat?
This is in Crescent Lake. And I think this is the Fairholme tree, which turned out to be 4,000 years old.
Is there anything different to do underwater when coring a tree than when above?
Well, I
water?
think one of the things that you have to do is you have to have something stabilizing you, because if you turn the increment bore, you tend to just twirl around, right? You have to anchor yourself somehow. And the other thing is, if you could imagine somebody just twirling around. Now, for some reason, I can't stop this.
It looks great.
Okay, well, we'll move on. It's a cool thing, and I'm really glad he gave me those cores, and I'm still in contact with him after all these years. He's now retired from the Park Service. But anyway, I'm coming to the end of the presentation now. There's a lot more work to be done. The good news is that tree ring scientists like Brian Black and Jesse Pearl are working with the U.S. Geological Survey. Brian Black, I've been working with the State Geologic Survey, Trevor Contreras and Emily Carson, the science teacher who I had a grant with. And so, but the dendrochronologists are still looking to help out to unravel this history, both of the past earthquakes that struck the Puget Lowland, but also to build a tree ring record back in time. And this is a pretty crude way to demonstrate building the tree ring record back in time. This is data from a long time ago, but it shows 3,000 years here with the present over at the far right-hand side. And it just shows what we want to do is build a record of tree rings back in time so that we can more precisely date past events here in the Northwest, plus also develop a climate record, a more information-packed record of the past climate in Washington. And these data, a lot of these data are just raw ring width measurements, whereas the data here in yellow at the very bottom is detrended. In other words, this is just showing the high frequency year-to-year variations. And you can detrend or work with data to show different kinds of things. But in a future manifestation of this, for example, you'd want to detrend or straighten out all the data here and turn it into high frequency data. And also at the same time, look for the longer period changes that may correspond with El Niños and this kind of phenomenon. So, so with that, I appreciate everyone hanging in there for this long presentation. And it's exactly 1 hour later. So I finished on time. Can we say that? And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, can you hear me, Pat?
I can.
Okay, so we had questions. Fortunately, there are so many scientists or knowledgeable people in our audience that there was an active chat going on in the background. People were answering other questions that others were posing. For example, somebody just asked, does coring injure a tree? And somebody said 100 years of dendrochronology shows no. So we got a really active chat going on. A few things I noted that I wanted to bring to you. Can you tell us the difference between CE, BP, and AD, and BCE? Three different terms mean different things, but some are interchangeable.
Right. So AD and BC refer to the birth of Christ about 2,000 years ago, a little over 2,000 years ago. And BCE stands for before the Common Era, and CE stands for Common Era. And it's just a sort of what would you call it? A secular way of dating. It's just a different way of dating.
Okay.
And it's using, the same datum, more or less, just expressing it in a different way. And by the way, there is one species of tree that I know is damaged by increment boring, and that is beech trees. Fagus, F-A-G-U-S, is the genus name. And I read a paper about those being susceptible, but Douglas firs and most other trees really are very resilient to coring.
Okay, another part of that BCE question is for AD, we set for BPA that set it before present being 1950, correct? That's still holding.
Oh, I see. I forgot BP, right? So before present is used by people who talk about radiocarbon dating, and that has to do with the testing of nuclear weapons about 1950 that mucked up the record of isotopes in the atmosphere. And so when we give ages in radiocarbon dating, we use 1950 as the present.
Okay. One of our in the audience didn't catch the name of the tribe that has the oral history of the whale.
I don't know which tribe that was because it's in, but I can tell you where to find it. It's various tribes that were interviewed, and it's in Arthur C. Ballard's book. If you just go, I know it's actually, you can actually read the book online at the University of Washington Library in their archives, and it's Arthur C. Ballard, B-A-L-L-A-R-D, probably a distant relative of mine. And he was, along with Ella E. Clark, who was the English professor at Washington State University. They were both people who interviewed older tribal members to get all their stories. So I don't know what you call them. Historians is what they were. And they interviewed these tribal members to get their stories, and they compiled all the stories. Arthur C. Ballard's is, I think, called The Mythology of the Puget Lobe Peoples or something like that. And it's 1929.
Okay, one more question I noted. On your wiggle plots, those are basically tree ring number versus tree ring thickness, correct?
Right. Those are years on the on the x-axis, and the size of the ring. Excuse me. Years are on the x-axis, horizontal. The size of each growth ring that you measure is on the y-axis. So it's measuring the ups and downs, the increase in size of each growth ring and the decrease in size. And in areas, in lowland areas, especially, or in drier areas like the American basin, like the Great Basin, tree ring width is highly correlated with soil moisture. So it's usually a representative of soil moisture. When you get up in higher latitudes or high elevations, it starts to change, but mainly we're measuring soil moisture changes. And so it's just one thing you can measure, but it's pretty reliable in terms of comparing it with other trees. Trees tend to go through the same ups and downs as soil moisture changes.
Yeah, but the one exception there, and the important one, is about volcanology and the opportunity for less sunlight and a big eruption. So
right, that plays a role too, for sure. And it just astounded me how global some of these light rings, these lower density rings, could be in response to a volcanic eruption. And, you know, I think one of the warnings on that is, you know, we can't control these volcanic eruptions. We're going to have another one, and you can't grow food when there's no sunlight. So humans better get their act together.
Okay, that's all the questions I noted, but if someone has one, they can pose it directly to Pat, or no, they can't do that, can they?
I see a few more coming in.
Okay.
So one that just came up, does your research, Pat, inform sea level changes over time?
Not directly. Not directly. I mean, I think some people, no, I don't think so. I mean, there is a relationship between the subfossil victim trees, say at Copalis and other places, which were lowered into, those were lowered into the sea level. So a change in relatives, you might say a change in relative sea level impacted those trees, right? But in terms of, I don't think so. In terms of sea level rising, not directly. You might be able to, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that really. I'm not using it for that reason, for that purpose at all.
Another new question comes in. It says, what new frontiers remain for tree ring dating or catastrophes in the Pacific Northwest? I think is the question.
I can see that from Carolyn Dreger, who she wants to know what catastrophe she's going to have to respond to soon. Right, Carolyn? I think the next frontiers have to do, well, we're working on one now, I think, with this amazing work that that Jesse Pearl and Charlotte Pearson and Brian Black have done in conjunction, working with Brian Sherrod on these faults and using the Miyake anomalies of 774 AD to try to date. I think that's an amazing thing. Also building back a record of tree rings back farther in the Holocene, back, you know, that will allow us to date more and more events to the year. And then we have, for example, I was mentioning this just yesterday, there are many locations, you know, there are more than 30 of these landslide dam lakes in just Washington alone that contain these subfossil trees. And there's two in particular that I thought about yesterday. One was Lake Kapausen, the state's first freshwater aquatic reserve, because it was killed, that lake was formed by the Electron Mud Flow, and it has some very large trees in it. Some of those trees have to be 700 or 800 years old. And so that would, if you could look at the tree rings in those trees, that would extend back and cross over the trees killed by the Seattle Fault in the early 900s. And then there's Day Lake up in the North Cascades, which dates to about 1,000 years old or so, and 1,100 years old. And it has huge trees in it also. So it has a lot of time capsules that are waiting to be sampled. And so I think projects that focused on harvesting a bunch of data from those lakes, Lake Kapausen, Greenwater lakes, which were formed 1,600 years ago and contain a forest. Each of those could get us back to good tree ring records for the last 2,000 years.
Okay. I think that's it for us. Thanks so much, Pat. You did a wonderful job. We had 121 participants at the half-hour point, so you currently hold the record for Quimper Geological Society largest Zoom meeting ever.
Do I get a medal? No, I don't want one. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you, Pat. And folks, if you have further questions, feel free to send them in on the, Michael, where's the best place to reach you all, or Pat, to reach you if folks have further questions that they want to chat with you about this topic?
I'll type my email address in the, whoops, it came.
Perfect. I know Paul Bellinger has some more very specific questions for you on C14 dating.
Well, did you put it there? Where'd you put it, Pat? Your email.
I typed it into the chat. Oh, wait a minute. I just sent it to Linton and he already knows it anyway.
List and find everybody.
All right.
And while Pat's doing that, just as a reminder, if you go to quimpergeology.org, you can find out more about this program and other events coming up. So if you enjoyed this talk, there will be a recording there later that you can share with your friends, and then also you can see some of our upcoming events. There it is.
At Pringle.
Thanks, Pat. That's really kind of you to share your info. Go ahead, Michael.
Where am I going?
I don't know. What's next?
We're pretty much done. There will be a talk December 12th on carbon sequestration by Will Gallen from DNR, and still working on, but probably will have Scott Burns, who's here still in the middle of my screen, giving a virtual wine terroir tasting of the Columbia Basin. If Scott's still up for that, raise your hand, Scott. He's up for it. So that's going to be January or February. So stock up on your wine, find something interesting, and we're going to have some discussions about how it became such a good wine. That's all I have from my end of it.
Wonderful. So if you all are still here and would like to wave goodbye, up in the top right corner of your screen, you can push the gallery view button so you can see everybody waving goodbye, and we'll wave it out as we end the meeting. Oh, look at all those cameras turning on. What a great audience you all have been. Thanks for being here, folks, and thanks so much to Pat and Michael for putting this together. Good night. Enjoy your evening.